So, me, my selfie, and I. I'm going to be covering quite a bit of ground. So put on your seatbelts. If you get whiplash, don't say I didn't warn you. Fasten your seatbelts. Because I want to give a big picture here to really make an argument for where I feel our culture is. I'm going to argue that today we live in a historical moment where myth, ancient myth, has become reality. And I'm referring specifically here to the Greek myth of Narcissus. You guys familiar with that story? This beautiful young man going for a walk in the forest, and he's thirsty, comes to a pool of water, which isn't moving at all, and he looks into this pool of water, and he falls in love with the image that he sees there. And he is so obsessed with the image in the pool that he loses his appetite, he can't sleep, and eventually he dies in a total obsession with himself. It's basically how the short version of the myth of Narcissus. And I think that myth reflects very profoundly what's going on in our world today. We are destroying ourselves because of our self-centeredness. I think this is the age of self in a really extraordinary way. Human beings, a Christian would assert, have always been selfish. Genesis 3 onward, we've been selfish beings. But today we're functioning in an unparalleled way in terms of our self-obsession. And that's the thing I want to focus on. We've always been selfish, but we are self-obsessed today. And that's the process I want to look at. This is rather well reflected, I think, in the selfie. The selfie seems to signify that a photo only has meaning if you're the one taking it and you're the one in the center of the photo. And that's quite a bit of self. So in some respects quite aptly named, but it's not my intention in this lecture to demonize the selfie and use it as evidence that this is the last throes of a dying civilization. And I'm not going to talk much about the selfie, although I could be tempted to. But I think the selfie perhaps serves as a potent reminder or a metaphor of our modern self-obsession. And this for me is perhaps the chief characteristic of modernity, the modern world we're part of. So that means if we're going to understand our culture, we really have to understand the dynamic of this self-obsession. So that's what I want to do. I want to look at the roots of how we got to this self-obsession, where it came from, what characterizes it, and where it's taking us. So I'm going to develop this along 4 lines, and this is a really big picture sketch. We're doing 2,000 years of history very quickly. So I want to paint the picture. The first thing I want to talk about is the self-centered worlds. And my angle here is not so much the self-centeredness of individuals. I want to reflect at how a whole civilization, starting in Europe, became self-centered. So I think self-centeredness is part of our cultural narrative. Now, if you go back to the 15th and 16th century, what you see then in terms of the civilization of Europe is that it's reestablished on a totally new center. Europe finds a new integration point in the 15th and 16th century. When we talk about integration points culturally, we're referring to what the Greeks called a cosmos. A cosmos for the Greeks was a point of harmony that brought everything together and provided the center. And human societies always require some kind of cosmos, a center that integrates things and gives it harmony. You need a center if you're going to really be a healthy civilization. Something needs to bind it together. So what happened in the 15th and 16th century is that there was a cleansing away of the old centers. In order to put a new center in place, we had to get rid of the old ones. And I see this in 2 ways. First of all, there was a cleansing of the old view of nature. The new science comes along, and Christians make a decisive contribution here. And the new science looks at the natural world and discovers that it's not enchanted. Nature is not permeated by magic and miracles. It functions much more like a machine. And I like to call this the secularization of nature. Thumbs up for that. The secularization of nature. The natural world is disenchanted, and that's a positive thing. And actually, it's a Christian worldview, which in terms of science, that makes a decisive contribution. What happened a little bit beyond that, as Christianity lost its focus, is that metaphysics died, which means the supernatural realm died altogether, and we land in naturalism as a dominant worldview. Nature is all that there is. But it started well. Secularized nature in terms of it's not permeated with magic, but that ends up in naturalism. But the first is the cleansing of our view of nature in terms of the old centers, and the second is a cleansing of how we dealt with old authority structures. So this was a slow removal of what we call the hierarchical ruling structure of the world. The hierarchical structure was that you were born into a world where you took your allotted place. And this was rooted in your hereditary, your genetics, what you were born into. And at the very top, you had a stamp of divinity. So European kings, the divine right of kings and queens. So you see there's a spirituality of rulership. And what happened in the 15th and 16th century is we have the secularization now of power. First of all, the secularization of nature, then the secularization of power, which creates a whole new social order. And this revolution also was set off by the Reformation in the 15th and 16th century with the recovery of a biblical worldview. And these changes, both of them actually rooted in the Bible, leads to a freedom for the individual person, which is quite wonderful and thoroughly biblical. We're not captive to magical forces within nature, the movement of the stars. Neither are we captive to the conditions of our birth, whether we're born in low hereditary or high hereditary. We're not captive to these things. Because the Bible's freedom establishes the dignity of all human persons. All are equal as image bearers before God. And all of us are given dominion over nature under the one rule of God. Now, despite the huge good that comes out of the Reformation, the influence of the Reformation, I believe, actually diminished quite quickly and tailed off in terms of being a cultural leader. It left its residue there foundationally, but in terms of really setting the agenda, quite quickly it's knocked off its pedestal. So what happens is religion, which is a central authority to culture, there's the cosmos, is replaced by science as the key cultural authority. So science becomes significant in terms of establishing a new center in cosmos. Now this is interesting because where religion is reference to God, science is very much reference to humans. And humans, of course, are the discoverers. This is our science. So these are our discoveries. But the problem with science is that science was never sufficient to actually become the center of a civilization. Science has a lot of authority in our culture, but it's not actually the center. It can't be. And that's because science is not substantial enough in what it covers to actually cover all of reality. It can't bring everything together. Science has a much more limited brief, and those of you who are scientists might not like that, but science could never be a cosmos, a center, provide all the harmony. So the question is, as these old centers died away, this cleansing took place, what's going to replace it? And as the old authority structures die out, the question remains, how do we reorganize the self? Christianity begins to lose its center ground, creating a vacuum. So we need this new center. It's not going to be in nature. That's been secularized. It's not going to be in the old authority structures, hereditary. Science isn't enough, so where's it going to come from? Well, here we come to my next point, the establishment of a new center. After the house cleansing of the old center, the only thing left to be at the center is the self. And this is the rise of humanism, the centrality of the human being at the center of everything. Now, this worked very well in terms of the 15th century. The 15th century was the age where human genius was unleashed. You know a bit about the story of Leonardo da Vinci. I mean, it's mind-boggling. This guy was like a god in his time. It really was a golden age, the 15th and 16th century. That's when we started from Europe, the exploration of the globe, remarkable advances in science and math and some of our technological feats. I like what was going on in the arts at that time. These are all achievements that were not even dreamed of formerly. So this is the golden age and the age of human genius. And all of this led to the throning of the self. So humans become the new center point of the universe. The age of humanism is launched. And as the German philosopher Feuerbach saw it, man's God now is man. He nailed it. Man's God is man. And this is the birth for me of the new age of self-centeredness. The egocentric civilization commences here. And I actually call this the ego-pagan era. Old paganism was nature paganism, very central to how everything functioned in ancient paganism. The new era of paganism is ego paganism, self at the center, and actually giving it a religious structure. So that's the story. I need to talk here about the seeds of destruction in this new center and the fact that they were there at the beginning. Like Icarus in the great Greek myths, this ascent of the self takes us up, 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 but like Icarus, we get too close to the sun. It melts the wax in our wings, and there's only one direction to go in. It's going to be crash and burn. So, and this is what I love about the history, 15th, 16th, 17th century, humanity under this new center, in this new center, reached giddy heights in terms of achievement, but actually there's some beginnings, problems written in from the beginning, and I believe these problems that were there in the beginning are beginning to fully emerge in our time. It's the 21st century where this new center of the self is really coming to fruition in terms of the inbuilt problems. Now I see two problems, fundamental problems with the self as the new center, present there at the beginning of the new era. The first is this: there's an unavoidable dialectic in the construction of this new center. As science removes the supernatural consensus, and we move increasingly towards naturalism, a materialistic worldview, this means that matter itself is named as the great absolute. So that's the materialistic worldview. Matter is ultimate. Atoms are fundamental. There's nothing behind atoms. And that leaves the question for the self, which is at the center, where do I as the self fit into this materialistic worldview? So the self is at the center, we're the new cosmos, we become the new gods presiding over the world, and yet the scientific consensus keeps establishing that we as selves are merely matter. And that is the great contradiction of our world, I see. This is the great dialectic, the great contradiction of the materialistic worldview. It's matter, materialism, versus the freedom of the self. So the materialistic worldview on the one hand says matter is everything, everything is fixed by law, which leaves no real room for freedom. Any freedom that there is only an illusion. And yet here this new center in the self is all about our freedom to make the world. The freedom of the self as the new gods is everything. So how do you reconcile a materialistic worldview with self at the center as the new God, as the new center? It's a contradiction. And I think this is actually, in terms of apologetics, the one that we need to really highlight. You can't have both. It's got to be one or the other. So that's the first problem written at the beginning. Science, the new science, under a biblical, the Christians who are doing this work secularizes nature. That's a good thing. But God disappears, self at the center. How do you reconcile self as God in a materialistic worldview? The second problem written at the very beginning, is what I'm going to call the problem of meaning. The Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor reminds us that the pre-modern person lived in anxiety about guilt. That's because pre-modern people believed in judgment. Religion is at the center. So in the old authority structure, guilt is real. So within the framework, all of us have to stand before God one day and give account for our acts as responsible creatures. So they were haunted by a fear of guilt. With the death of God and the establishment of the new center, moderns become anxious about something else. And this is meaning. That's what moderns are really anxious about. Is there meaning? And the reason this is a problem is, I think many philosophers are doing good work here today. Meaning is difficult, if not impossible, without God terms. There's a famous philosopher in Cambridge at the moment who's actually really arguing this as a naturalist. Can we actually account for meaning within a naturalistic worldview? You need the God terms. Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi of England, buy his books and read them. He's brilliant. His book, The Great Partnership, which is actually looking at the relationship between religion and science, he sums it up in this line. He said, science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts them back together to see what they mean. It's not perfect, but I like it. Science takes things apart to see how they work, but it doesn't give a meaning. It's religion that puts things back together to see what they mean. The point being this, that as religion dies off in the making of the modern world, it happened gradually, it enters inevitably, I would say, a meaning deficit. And that's the problem of moderns today. The problem of meaning. Not the problem of guilt and judgment, it's the problem of meaning. The great Blaise Pascal, the French philosopher, saw all of this as he stood at the dawn of the new worlds. He said this, humans have done everything. That's a reflection of the human genius. We've done everything, except, he says, secure the position of God and thereby the meaning of man. We've done everything except secure the position of God and thereby the meaning of man. That was the problem at the very beginning. So the problem of meaning for moderns was built in at the very beginning. And I'm going to show you a bit later on how that's reached its fruition in our times. The 21st century is the century of meaning deficit. That's the problem. So that's the first part of the story. It's the story of self-centeredness, the self-centered world. I want to move on in my second main point to what I'm calling the self-determined worlds. There's a flow here in terms of my argument. We start with self-centeredness, then we move to self-determination. If we're the gods, if we're the center, that's the prerogative of the gods to determine how reality should function. The gods get to impose their freedom and will upon the world, upon reality. So given that the new center is now in the self, no longer do we have to find our place in the universe, as pre-moderns had to do. Now we construct the worlds. This is a very natural step when God is removed from the center of Europe. So Pope, the famous poet, his famous line, I am the captain of my soul. It's me who is going to determine how things should be. Humans are the ultimate authority. It's not in religion, it's not in God. We are the ones who self-determine reality. Now this happens along a number of lines. Let me mention two things very briefly. First of all, we self-determine in terms of the establishment of a new moral order. The modern self, at the center, as the new gods, constructs moral order for the world. So no longer is moral order rooted in the Bible's revelation, because religion has been demoted now as the chief authority. And over time, moral order is not rooted in nature. There's a long tradition in Europe of natural law. So you could derive some law, moral order, from nature itself. But now not even nature has any say. Except for a few philosophers, natural laws die to death. And that's because, as one thinker saw it, nature embodies what we most fear, which is a nameless and faceless death. So we turn on nature now with a vengeance. We're not going to get our morality from nature. Now we completely self-determine it. As the new center, we can determine what is morally right and what is morally wrong. And I think the same-sex marriage thing and the transgender thing is the ultimate example of this. I think what we have to see is actually this is the hatred of nature. It's the total self-determination of morality, pushing the boundaries of our so-called freedom as far as we possibly can. It's ultimate self-determination. So that's the first thing that happens under self-determination. The second is this. We self-determine a new version of human flourishing. That's what the gods do. The gods determine what the good life looks like. The gods determine their versions of utopia. I don't think it's a coincidence that the 16th century was the heyday of the utopian novel. Thomas More wrote a famous one. I tried to read it. I couldn't get through it. But apparently lots of utopian novels, because we're now the makers of what the good life, what utopia looks like. Basically, we're going to reinvent the idea of heaven. We're at the center. We're the new gods. We determine the morality. We determine what heaven really is. And heaven is no more going to be something which occurs beyond this world in terms of time and eternity. Now it's up to the modern self to determine what heaven is. And we're not interested in an afterlife. The focus is all about now. We create heaven by our self-determination now. So human flourishing is now a totally this world focus. And that is our movement into what Aldous Huxley called the Brave New Worlds. Great novel. Read The Brave New World. It's translated into all language, but this is basically a classic example of self-determination. We don't need God for heaven. We build heaven ourselves. We determine what it looks like and we build it through our technology, techniques, and so forth. So self-centeredness, new center in the self rather than religion or science, which couldn't bear that burden. And then to self-determination, we self-determine morality in a very extreme way. We self-determine a new version of heaven. But here we need to mention what I call a very personal challenge, and it's this. The self may be able to determine morality, for good or for bad. The self may be able to determine a utopia, a brave new world. The question remains, can the self determine the self? So the question is the self a sufficient integration point for the self? And the answer to that is no. And the point is this, if the self is the new center, we have set ourselves up as a civilization for a perpetual identity crisis. From the center, we can secure everything in the universe except ourself. And so we're going to lack, if we're at the center, a secure identity. And the reason for this, it sounds complex, but I think it's quite simple. It's impossible for the self to know the self. So on a personal level, you as the subject look out and you know the world around you and you name the world around you. And the one thing that's excluded from your knowing is yourself. You as the knower. So we know everything outside of ourselves. We can call that subject-object relationship. We know everything except the subject, which is ourselves. Nietzsche, the German philosopher, really understood this. He wrote that we are unknown, we knowers, to ourselves. Now, people can sometimes get offended. I like with someone I'm getting on with well to just wind them up with this comment. I usually drop it like this. Do you know, we've only known each other for 10 minutes, but I know you better than you know yourself. And they look a little bit of offended. I said, but you know me also better than I know myself. The fact is, we only see and perceive what's beyond us. From the subject to the world beyond us, to the external. So our eyes only point outwards. Your eyes never swivel round and look inwards into your subjective self, the more mysterious part of you. None of you have ever seen your face. That's as much as my face as I've ever seen. The tip of my nose right there. Every other view of my face I've had has been second-hand. It's been an image of my face. I have never seen my face, but I've seen your face. So I know you in a way you don't know yourself. It's freaky, isn't it? When you look at a group photo, and you're in that group photo, who's the first person you look at? I mean, it's bizarre. We live with ourselves all the time, and what we're doing is, that doesn't look like me, or maybe it looks a bit like me, or I've got one photo in the collection I think is me. My son's on my shoulder, and I thought, that's what I look like. No other photo has ever got close to actually reflecting what I look like. I mean, that's bizarre. I don't know myself that well. We're all the same. Now, there's a good reason for this, and this can get quite technical, but I think this is the simplest way to express it. The creator of the universe, our creator and father, made the human person in his own image. So the human self exists as the image of another. So the image exists only in relation to the one we image. When you go into the bathroom in the morning and look in the mirror, the image that's in the mirror there exists only because the real you is there. So it's the same with us. We are the image of God, and we exist only in relationship to the one we image. And that means the only way the self can be signified, given a secure identity, is if we look beyond ourselves to the one we image. That's the beyond identity principle. So to look at ourselves is only to look at an image. And that's never, ever going to yield self-knowledge that's secure enough to really signify us. Hence why if the self is at the center as the integration point for an identity, we're going to be very, very unstable. So the self can't possibly determine the self. There's a real limitation here. The self simply cannot be an integration point for the self. And this actually reflects that the self is a very fragile entity. We are easily damaged if we search for identities in the wrong places. But the irony today is the more we discover the fragility of the self, the harder we try to establish our own identities. I'll talk about that in a moment. So moderns are in this perpetual quest for personal identity. For me, it's one of the great ironies of the modern world. It's good as Christians to name ironies that we see around us, things that just don't add up. And here's the irony. I believe moderns give more attention to the question of personal identity than others ever have in the past. So you think with all this attention we give to who am I, my personal identity, we'd be pretty good at our personal identity. But we've never been more lost as to who we are. So we go in this endless cycle. Define the self, redefine the self. Imagine the self, reimagine the self. Invent the self, reinvent the self in some kind of new form. And this happens because we're image bearers. And because we're an image, the harder we try to determine the self, the worse it becomes. And I would say the more we go in this process, the thinner we become. We become thinned out. We do deep psychological damage to ourselves. So the point is, as modern civilization became self-centered, that's the new cosmos, with new powers of self-determination, it all looked very wonderful and attractive, but the point is, it's not really cracked up what it ought to be. There are some serious defects, especially when it comes to getting a secure identity. Then under this point of self-determination, I want to talk about new sources of the self. Very briefly here. In the making of the modern world, there were actually some thinkers who recognized the problem. They saw that if you remove religion, if you remove God, the self, the new self, is going to have to be reorganized. It's going to have to be set up on a new footing to work well. We're going to need new sources for the self to determine clear identity. The human personality in the modern world would need reorganizing. Now, this project reached its full flowering in the mid-19th century. The old sources didn't die out all at once. And I'm just going to say this and leave it. I believe the architects of the modern self are Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. We often go to philosophy here, but these guys are the architects of the modern self. If you want a great book to read here, Philip Rieff, The Triumph of the Therapeutic. And he shows how these two provided the terms for the reorganization in quite different directions. But I think he makes a great case. These two are the architects of the modern self and the new sources. Right. Following me? The new self-centeredness, that's the new center, that's the new cosmos. With that, new powers of self-determination, but there's problems written in from the beginning. Big problems. Now I want to talk about the self-conscious worlds. So now we're the ego-centric civilization, in individual selves everywhere in this endless search for an identity. What this has given to moderns is a very high level, a very intense level of self-consciousness. We are so aware and conscious of me, of myself. So it's no wonder that we're obsessed with selfies, because we have this high level of consciousness with respect to self. Now here I need to talk about the irony of self-consciousness. Because self-consciousness is actually part of the glory of the human person. To be self-conscious is something that distinguishes us from animals. To be self-conscious is to have this capacity to be self-aware, to be cognizant of myself in the first person. And this exists as a kind of mental awareness. So I can think about the content of my thoughts. That should blow your mind. That really is quite something. And this is part of the evidence that Christian philosophers are using in terms of showing that we exist beyond the borders of nature. The fact that we can think about the content of ourselves is hard to fit into a naturalistic world. It's the problem of mind and what the mind is. There's nothing in nature that captures this kind of awareness. It has to be more than neural pathways. So self-consciousness is a wonderful thing. However, it's also a very dangerous thing. If it's in the right place, it's the measure of our glory, of our personhood. But if it tips over and goes beyond its proper place, it begins to devour us and destroy us. And beyond certain limits, self-consciousness becomes cancerous. And I believe this is one of our modern contagions, excessive self-consciousness. It's self-consciousness in the hyper stage, well beyond the limit of what the Creator intended. And what this means is that for moderns, reality now is much more in than it is out. It's what's going on internally, which is the important thing, because we're so inwardly focused. And we've lost touch increasingly with what's really happening outside of us. And this again is where the myth of Narcissus comes in. He went so far into his own image that he lost touch with the world around him. That's what happened, wasn't it? And that's why today, if we're excessively self-conscious, this reality becomes much more inwardly defined than it is out. We're keyed to what's going inside my head, rather than we are about, how are you? How are you doing? So I believe moderns tend to be highly introspective. We are so aware of ourself in relationship to everything. And in this sense, we are self-obsessed. Obsessed with what's going on internally, the content of our thoughts. And this is classic narcissism. Now, I have a certain sympathy with narcissism because I think it was a defense in some ways and all kinds of cultural factors which are just crushing us. Materialism is not a great worldview in order to build up the worth of the self. You are merely atoms. Oh, I feel really great about that. Thank you. No wonder we retreated inward. And I think there are other factors in the modern world which is highly depersonalized the self, especially in terms of the public place. So I think there are reasons, and I've done lots of lecturing this, on why we made this retreat inwards. So going inside is kind of coming into a shelter, a refuge from these crushing forces around us. The refuge of the self is the one safe space that we can be in. But what it does is leads us to what I call the locked-in syndrome. And we begin to live way too much in our heads. Some describe it as the paralysis of analysis. It's not just intellectuals who do that. I see people on the most basic kind of decisions just constantly go round and round and round inside their heads. They get lost inside themselves. And I can tell you, excessive self-consciousness is very dangerous. We become so preoccupied with ourselves that we lose meaningful contact with reality, including persons. It cuts us off from healthy relationship. So when the self is turned in on the self, really we have something cancerous going on. That's what the cells do in cancer. The cells turn against the cells, and what normally brings life turns against us and begins to destroy us. So it is with our excessive self-consciousness. It's a condition. And I think it's becoming more and more accelerated in younger generations. It's a condition that is really damaging us and thinning us out. And I would say the epidemic of cultural depression that's all around today is very much linked to this condition of excessive self-consciousness. It's a modern plague. And it means that people are losing touch with what's going on in the world beyond them. So that's the problem of this excessive self-consciousness. Reality is more in than out. The other is that it moves us towards what I'm calling the banal. This is the third point. To be excessively self-conscious moves us towards the banal. Banality is living with the thinnest layer of meaning. Very thin. And that's the nature of consciousness. If you're just living in your internal world, in your consciousness, you're just living in your brain state. And consciousness is actually much thinner than reality. So if we live inside of our heads, we're going to get thinned out. The great poet T.S. Eliot describes the modern as filled with fancies. Fancies is nothingness and empty of meaning. Great descriptive phrase. And that's why our sickness today is not so much related to the issue of guilt, but rather to meaning. Because of this thinning out, this being locked inside of ourselves. It's the consequence of our extreme self-consciousness. Again, Nietzsche was rather prophetic when he looked ahead and said this: with the death of God, Western culture is going to become hollowed out. If a culture is hollowed out, it's emptied of meaning. And that's true also for individual persons. When the self becomes the new integration point, it tended towards this fearful hollowing out. And that's a terrible place to live from. George MacDonald, in the early 19th century, I think described this condition remarkably in Lilith, one of my favorite novels, and he has this wonderful phrase there of being enfolded in nothingness. Enfolded in nothingness. How many of you guys have seen the recent TV drama True Detective? Quite remarkable. Hard, but it's worth persevering. Well, if you can cope with it. Not all of us can cope with that kind of thing. But there's a quote in the first episode which I found so striking. One of the main characters, Rustin, he's a cynic, is asked about his philosophy of life. Driving along, what's your philosophy of life, Rustin? Here's what he says. I'd consider myself a realist, yep. But in philosophical terms, I'm what's called a pessimist. I think human consciousness is a tragic misstep in evolution. We have become too self-aware. Nature created an aspect of nature separate from ourselves. We are creatures that should not exist by natural law. We are a thing that labors under the illusion of having a self. That accretion of sensory experience and feeling programmed with total assurance that we are each somebody when in fact we are nobody. I think the honorable thing for our species is to deny our programming and stop reproducing. Let's walk hand in hand into extinction. One last midnight, brothers and sisters, opting out of a raw deal. Not much meaning there. Very poignant. So, new center, self-centered civilization with powers of self-determination. But now that we're at the center, we have no way to integrate ourselves on identity problems, so we become increasingly self-conscious. My third point. And then my last point is we move into the world of the self-referential. And this is the final piece, into the self-referential worlds. This obsessive self-consciousness of modern persons has led to a reorganization of how we deal with reality. And this is how I see it working. First of all, we deal with the world outside of us as a mirror. Now, what do mirrors do? Mirrors are self-reflectors. Mirrors bounce the self back to you. That's what a mirror does. And that's the nature of self-referential experience. Everything you engage brings the self back to you. That's how we use reality. We use it to the end of bending everything back to the self. So what's beyond us is not appreciated for having its own existence. So I come into a room full of people, see Uri, and I don't see Uri as separate from me. He's a mirror. And he's frowning at me a little bit, and I feel insecure because you're just a mirror. You're reflecting a negative message to myself. But if you smile now, yes, I'm the champion. But I never really acknowledge Uri as Uri. That's narcissism. That's dealing with reality in a self-referential way, basically reality as a mirror. Now, this self-referential way of dealing with reality is again connected to the problem of identity. Here we are so lost in self-consciousness, not sure of who we are, so we're endlessly creating new identities. And as we do that, we become thinner and thinner and more ghost-like. And that's a very insecure state of being, to be ghost-like and thin in terms of who we are. So what we do in this is we begin to take our revenge on reality, the world outside of us. So we use the world outside as we escape our self-consciousness as the mirror. But still, it's just to reflect something back to me, to make me feel real. So that becomes the way we use reality. It's all about the self. So in terms that some philosophers has used, it's no longer I, you, I as a person relating to you as a person, you're I, with the distinction between us built in. Now it's more like I am you. There's more of a loss of a distinction between myself and the other. And you're simply a reference point for my self-comprehension in the mirror effect. And so we begin to use everything like this, especially people. It's basically a modern form of cannibalism, trying to suck the whole world into ourselves. And it's also a form of extreme subjectivity. We're actually taking flight from reality, the external worlds, and we don't take that very seriously at all. We use everything in a totally subjective manner. Now, this was illustrated in a very funny way by one of my favorite English journalists. He's a comedian called Charlie Brooker. Do you know Charlie Brooker? And he was writing something on Twitter and Instagram. And he basically was saying in this article, all social media interactions are totally self-referential. And he makes a good case for it. He said, all social media interactions are about the self. He says, there is never, he's exaggerating, there has never been a single tweet or Instagram that could not be replaced with, please authenticate my existence. And he goes on to suggest that all social media be reduced to a series of beeps. He said, why use words? It's just simpler to use beeps. So here's how it would go. You would go, I'd go to you, beep, and that would be translated as, please authenticate my existence. And you would go, bip, bip, which says, existence authenticated, please authenticate mine. And then I'd go, beep, which is existence authenticated, and then the discourse could end. He says, let's just reduce it to that. But the point is, it's all about self-authentication. It's totally self-referential. Now, I'm not demonizing social media here, but I think it's an example of how we use the world in a very self-referential manner, everything bent back to the self. So, self-referentialism in the world is a mirror. I want to use another mirror, a metaphor here in terms of my second point. It's about living in glass houses. To further understand how the self-referential posture works, we need to change the metaphor from mirror to that of glass house. So here we are, excessively self-conscious. And that leaves us feeling alienated, alone, because we're locked into ourselves. And we're treating reality in a very self-centered way. So what do? Well, from this locked-in point, what we do is we fashion a glass house around us. And why is the glass house around us made of glass? Well, locked inside ourselves, we need to curate our self-made identities to others. So we have to start curating identities. So we do this by exposing ourselves to anyone who will click on our Facebook page, read our Twitter, or click on our Instagram. That's the glass house. So we expose ourselves to others. I share, therefore I am. And we engage in almost endless acts of self-exposure from within our glass houses. Curating our identities to others, we construct them, we determine them, because there's no solid point to have an identity in. And all we want is for the other to affirm them. We're back to the bip-bip. Now, this world of glass houses today is really getting increasingly bizarre, and this is not where this lecture is going. We could do a lecture on this, but there are instances where a white woman curates her identity in social media as a black woman. I share, therefore I am, and all you need to do is perceive me like that, and then I'm authenticated. It's within the glass house. Now that's at the extreme end, but I would say at the less extreme end, a lot of what's going on is, this is who I am. I'm a happy person. Look at all my photos. I'm smiling in all of them. I'm such a happy person. Or, I'm such a spiritual person. Look at all the Bible quotes on my Facebook page. Or, I'm a party person. Look at me. I'm drunk at the bottom of the stairs, and it's happened 3 weeks in a row. And every click that you get back on these curated identities affirms the self. It's interesting. Back in the 16th century, René Descartes, the French philosopher, posited the essence of human identity in being a thinking self. So you've got his famous, I think, therefore I am. Now, as the identity and security of the modern self becomes increasingly fragile, we've moved to a very different point. Firstly, we say, I share, therefore I am. And then we have to add to that, I am perceived, therefore I am. But the point is, in those two things, I share, in terms of identity, therefore I am, I have an identity, but you have to perceive me, you have to click, so I am perceived by you, and therefore I am. So now the quest of the self is to curate the identity as often as possible, and to be perceived in this act by as many as possible. Now my point is that this is a totally self-referential way to function, because it's all about the self. So, self-referentialism, the world's a mirror, living in glass houses, And now I want to talk about the new ethical imperative within this framework of self-referentialism: be true to yourself. This self-referential approach to life has forged a new path in terms of what shapes our ethics, or values as some would call it. Charles Taylor calls this the ethics of authenticity. The highest ethic we live by as moderns is I must be true to myself. And that's because everything is bent back to the self, or how could it be any other way? I have asked thousands over the past few years, what's the highest value that guides them through life? And almost everyone has given some version that amounts to be true to myself, to be authentic. Many Christians say the same. The highest value, to be authentic. If we locked a group into Westminster in London today in order to come up with a catechism for modern selves, and we posited the first question, what is the chief end of human persons? What are we to live for? The answer would be that the chief end of a human person is to emerge fully into who you really are. That would be the answer, I reckon. That's the main goal of life: to find yourself, to curate it, and to be yourself, to be true to who you are. And of course, the irony of this is that we're struggling to be what we're very insecure about in terms of our identities. We're trying to be true often to our ghost, to something which is very insubstantial. So this new ethical imperative, be true to yourself, is part of the self-referentialism. And then finally here, the fourth point under my fourth main point, we have a new measure of reality. And the new measure is intensity over profundity. Intensity over profundity. And this again is the consequence of a self-referential engagement with reality. Here we are. We feel pretty empty internally in terms of who we are. We feel like a ghost. And how can a ghost thereby be made to feel real? Well, it makes sense that the best solution would be the intensity of what you're experiencing at any given moment. So the task of experience now is to make you feel alive. And the more intense you experience something, the more real you become. So that means reality becomes measured by the intensity of what's going on within you, the rush of your feelings, the rush of your bodily appetites. That's a measure of reality. It's actually how many Christians measure their spiritual reality. Their relationship with God comes down to the intensity of what they're experiencing. So when the intensity is high, your faith is high. But when the experience dissipates, it's quite easy to move into, I guess it's not true, because I'm not experiencing it. So the measure of the reality of faith is very much in the intensity of experience. And this means that meaning becomes reduced to sensation within the body. That's what I mean by the intensity over profundity principle. And that's a terrible revenge to take on meaning. Think of all the meanings of God's universe and to reduce it to sensation. And that's why for so many modern selves, the real is measured by the rush. It's really focused to the senses. We could give lots of examples of that. The American writer Walker Percy rather irreverently described the typical modern man as a ghost with an erection. Quite picturesque, isn't it? Looking for the next sexual encounter to give the experience of feeling alive. I think it's perfect. Because a lot of this intense experience today is in sexual practice. The ghost, nothing there, with an erection to try and make himself feel alive again. The old path in Europe was founded on some kind of I believe. The new path is boiled down to I experience. And this is one of the reasons why moderns are so easily bored. Because when the intense experience is absent, we become very restless and irritated with the present. We become distracted. Again, T.S. Eliot, several times in his great poem, The Four Quartets, has this line: distracted from distraction by distraction. Wow. T.S., you're a prophet. Distracted from distraction by distraction. And when the measure of reality is reduced to an intense experience, we reduce everything to affectivity. And I call this the affective revolution. What we feel becomes the full measure of reality. So the state of one's marriage is reduced to how I feel in my marriage. That's the measure of whether it's good or bad. And it's the same with our experience of God. So, you know, I like talking about happy things. But that is my rather bleak analysis of where we are today in terms of where the place the modern person occupies. It's not a happy place. And my point is that this modern self-obsession that we're immersed in was actually there at the beginning with all the problems written in. When we founded reality on the self, put the self in the center, this is what we're going to be led to, step by step, into a wasteland. And I think the 21st century is the real emergence of the wasteland, of the new idolatry of the self. Now, of course, I need to finish by asking whether there's a way out of this mess. And of course, the answer is an emphatic yes. No situation is ever beyond the redemption of the gospel. No situation. And the gospel today has to begin with a recognition that the self is not the true center of reality. Individually, and I pray corporately, Europe needs to repent of that. And then we have to turn to the one who really is the center. And the center is the Lord Jesus Christ. He has enough glory to fill the center of reality and to hold everything together, to integrate everything. And of course, we're called, as we were told this morning, we're all called to bow to that center, this personal center, the source of our life, of our personhood, of our joy, of everything that is, the true center and cosmos of reality, the Lord Jesus Christ. And He alone is the way of escape from this self-obsession. It has to come through the finished work of Christ. And we have to assert that apart from Him, we're nothing, because we are His image. And an image in itself is nothing. But in relationship to Him, as we behold His glory, we become real. So the key to the human self, the New Testament says, is in the reality of who Jesus is. When His person becomes our main focus, then the self is able to emerge in a stable and coherent way. But we have to get the focus off of ourselves. This is another one of the great ironies at the center of Christianity. When our preoccupation with ourselves die, we truly emerge. We become a someone, a person. And that's why the gospel is a call to go beyond the self, to the glory of Christ. And that's not because it's self-negating, the awful self. No, it's just the way the self is secured. It's the way we become most real. So to be our true selves, we have to become other-centered, centered on the glory of God. And when the self is raised up like this, we become who we are in Christ, who is the truly glorious one. So when Christ is rightly acknowledged as the true center, then the self truly lives. Now, how we embed that in the center of European civilization is another thing. It's got to start with us personally, I would say. We have to start living this out radically ourselves, and then it has to work out from there.